4:15 here on All in a Day. In Tanya Leibert's eerie short story, 10 Steps to a Whole New You, the main character realizes something about herself after an encounter with a blood-drawing sukuyon. As Leibert writes, "These are the things that you remembered from when you rose from the dead, having been laid to rest at home. That you had a new strength, agile hips, and all your old creaks and pains were gone. That now you had clarity, because the fog lift, that gone too. None of them scatter feelings or thoughts. That you now know that the folk tales were true." Meanwhile, in Waubgeshig Rice's book Moon of the Crusted Snow, often described as a post-apocalyptic novel, one of the characters, the elder Eileen, who tells Nanabush stories, refuses to call what their community is going through an apocalypse, saying, "Apocalypse, what a silly word. I can tell you there's no word like that in Ojibwe. Well, I never heard a word like that from my elders anyway." And then she goes on to explain how our world isn't ending. It already ended. It ended when the Zagnash came into our original home down south on that bay and took it from us. That was our world. Now, in both of these stories, Tanya and Waubgeshig draw on their own heritage, history, culture, and folklore when they write. She was raised in Trinidad, he was raised in the Wasauksing First Nation, and tonight they are among the authors talking in the virtual event Tales from Home, put on by the Conference on Canadian Content in Speculative Arts and Literature, or CanCon SF, exploring the idea of how folklore and history can be woven into science fiction and fantasy and horror. I'm very excited to have the two talented authors on the line with me now, Waubgeshig and Tanya. Hi there.
Hey.
Hi, Alan.
So, Tanya, I made the mistake of reading your story alone in the dark at like 2 in the morning. I am not recommending this out there for people who want to sleep at all. When were you first aware of the stories of a Sukuyon?
Oh, Lord. I'm sorry, that's my bird.
I don't know what to believe about Tanya at all
whenever
anymore.
I talk, like I have the door closed. He's out there, and you can probably still hear him.
After reading the story, I don't know what to believe about you, Tanya. So, let's
see. I don't know a specific time, but I mean, tales and people talk about things, and you read things, and there's festivals, and there's people like Paul Keith Douglas, who has famous characters, and he's I don't know how to explain what Paul Keith Douglas is for North Americans. He is a combination of a performance artist and a comedian, because that's what he does. So there's lots of that in Trinidad. There's like carnival, and there's like people like the Midnight Robber, which is another folklore character that wears a hat that's like a sombrero from hell with an Afrocentric goth sensibility. He has, this like what a Midnight Robber does is kind of like what rapping is. He speaks poetry, and it's with a black horror bent.
No.
And in that vein, it's all around you all the time. So I can't really place a time when I can say, yeah, that's when I found out about Sukunya, because it's always been there.
Were you scared of these stories when you were little?
Not really. No. I thought them. I grew up spiritual, not religious, and I'm probably revealing what Trinidad back in the 80s when I was there, you could not really tell people that your parents were separated. You could not really tell people that you didn't go to church, because people look at you funny, right? Yeah. Which is kind of the opposite of what people think West Indians are, bohemians who smoke weed all the time. Nobody in my family smokes weed. In fact, I have an aunt who refuses to use cannabis for her joints.
Wow.
And I've tried to argue with her about that. So, yeah.
For you, did the stories or legends, were there stories that scared you as a kid that stuck with you in your head?
Yeah.
Sorry. This one's for Wob. This one's for Waubgeshig.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Wendigo stories that we heard as we were kids, and the Wendigo is sort of alluded to in Moon of the Crusted Snow, although not explicitly mentioned. But those were stories we heard as children growing up in the res. And the Wendigo is a figure that, was said to come into communities when they're at the most vulnerable and exploit them, particularly in the wintertime. It would sort of manipulate community members to turn against each other and ultimately cannibalize each other. And some of the first Wendigo stories I heard as a kid were ultimately to deter us from eating each other, right? Even though that wasn't like an actual threat at the time, but that was sort of the origin of those stories in my community and of the Anishinaabe where I'm from. So yeah, those are some of the more, I guess, horrific sort of elements of that kind of storytelling for me anyway.
I mean, it's interesting because in your book, I mean, there's such a trust factor at play in terms of who you let in to a community, how much you trust the people you know, how much you trust the stories you've been told. And I know that's always a theme in a lot of horror and science fiction in general, the idea of who you let in. Do you find it's heightened at all for when you're reading genre works by Indigenous writers, Wab? That idea of the trust factor of who you let in is heightened in terms of its importance sometimes?
Oh, I definitely think so. And that relates to either being colonized or marginalized as a people and, dealing with, I guess, an oppressive regime that ultimately wants to erase your culture or control you. So in that sense, I think, what I write in many ways is an allegory for colonialism. And Moon of the Crescent Snow specifically is meant to reflect that as well, right? You have this community that's enduring this world-ending blackout, and they're at the risk of being colonized again by these outside forces that are looking to overtake, what little land and what little culture and connection they have to their history left, So, it is. You have to consider who you trust because the history has shown there aren't a lot of people you can trust, right, when you're in the so-called margins.
Yeah, I just to clarify to everybody out there, Wab's book is equally unsettling. Like, I don't want him to feel like only Tanya had me unnerved when I was reading the works at all. Tanya, that idea of the trust factor at play in horror and sci-fi, do you find it weaves itself into a lot of your works as well?
Yes. In a novel that I am sort of shopping around, that is, it also features the Sukyon, but this time as a main character that sort of gets a conscience through a magical incident. But yeah, there is that element of she's trying to protect the 5 people from her ex partner in crime who thinks of them as toys and meat. So they're when the threat starts coming, she has to actually reveal to them that she is a Sukyon, and then, things just start happening from there because their trust with her is sort of broken, and now they have to reestablish, is she really on our side?
Yeah.
So, that she has to handle all that and still tell them, look, whatever I am, there's more dangerous things out there, and you need to watch yourself.
Yeah, and
so
that's a fantastic example then of that idea of what assumptions we make about people and how we end up being able to cross that line. I'm taking you back here. In 1994, the Toronto Star had a piece about a teacher who was retiring from Jarvis Collegiate, Jennifer Walcott, who, it says, revitalized a dormant school club, Ujamaa, that celebrated African and Caribbean heritage by studying black history, authors, and poets rather than dead white males. And a 19-year-old student named Tanya Liebert is quoted as saying, she's one of those rare teachers that really motivates you. Ms. Walcott is like the teachers I remember most in Trinidad, the ones that pull you in. They don't let go. They're stern. They care. They don't just teach. They give themselves. So this is back in 1994. I wondered what effect that idea had on your desire to tell your own stories.
Oh, my God. Where did you find that? Okay.
It's out there.
I was just about to say I knew her, and then you quoted me. But yeah, she was very instrumental. She was a different sort of teacher. The other teacher that sort of came close to that was Miss Mohammed Yasu. She herself was from Trinidad. She was East Indian, but her husband is black, which tends to happen in Trinidad a lot. But Miss Walcott was from her origins are from Jamaica. She went on to teach in another school in the Rosedale area afterwards. But yeah, she brought in a different energy. She energized the students of African descent mostly on the English side, like the people with Caribbean heritage, which was mostly that, and people from the Caribbean who had English as a first language. I mean, speaking of English as a first language, there was a student from Trinidad whose patois was so thick they thought she was speaking Spanish, and they put her in the ESL department in Jarvis. And Miss Mohammed Yasu, who I just mentioned, fought to get her in the English side because she's from Trinidad, she can understand her. You know, it's English, it's just patois. You know, so those two teachers, they helped elevate us to a point where our culture was celebrated and not put under the white colonial gaze that you run into when you come to North America. But yeah, she was great.
Well, well, I'll ask the same question of you. If there was someone who really inspired you to be proud of and use stories from Waubgeshig First Nation, or as opposed to the people who warn you and say, "Oh, wait a minute, what if white readers don't get it? What if this doesn't sell the way it's supposed to?" Who are the people that were pushing you to use it?
Well, I think it starts with an aunt of mine who first exposed me to Indigenous literature, and this was back when I was in high school in the 90s, much like Tanya. She asked me, my Aunt Elaine asked me about the books I was reading in the curriculum. And I said, you know, the dead white guys, as mentioned by that teacher earlier. Yeah. And she just kind of made a note of that and then started giving me books by, you know, Louise Erdrich and Thomas King, Richard Waughemees, and Lee Miracle, and so on, back when I was a teen in the 90s, right? So that opened my eyes to the potential of taking our experiences and our stories and putting them on, you know, the written page and binding them into sort of book format. And in many ways, like, it sort of legitimized that for me because, you know, at that age, you sort of, you know, the book is held up as the pinnacle of storytelling, right? And it absolutely isn't, but that's the way sort of mainstream society brainwashes you into believing what art is, right, you know? Right, yeah. But at the same time, it is a viable form of expression for us. And I saw how people like Lee Miracle would take her solo stories of their prominent cultural figures and put them into books. And then, you know, Richard Van Camp took a lot of his Klitschko stories from the North and, you know, expressed a lot of, like, the figures, much like the Wendigo that I mentioned earlier in our culture, into his books. And I was really inspired by that. And I wanted to sort of emulate that in some way, too. All the while, you know, staying true to our culture and our history and our experiences overall, right? So, yeah, it was a number of people who really led me onto this path that I'm on today, and I'm very grateful.
I think the two of you are probably going to inspire many, many more. We miss you here in Ottawa, Mr. Rice, as well.
Oh, I miss you too.
For people who remember Rob on CBC Ottawa before he went off to become literary superstar, he was here as well. Both of you, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck tonight.
Thanks a lot, Alan.
Very much.
Tanya Liebert and Waubgeshig Rice, two of the authors taking part in tonight's CanCon SF virtual event, Tales from Home. It starts at 7 p.m., and we will tweet out a link very shortly from CBC All in a Day.